With Tears of the Kingdom right around the corner, the game we have been waiting 6 years for is almost here. But Nintendo being Nintendo has done a decent job at feeding us little information as possible over this time. From what we know so far, this is a Zelda game in that same art style as Breath of the Wild, using the same base map and will likely share very similar mechanics in terms of using rune-like powers and fighting bases of enemies. One thing I'm curious about though is what will the actual story structure be in this new game? Will it be the same as Breath of the Wild? Maybe a bit more similar to past 3D Zelda games? Or even a mixture of the two? Seeing as nothing has been confirmed yet, I thought I would go through some knowledge we have to try and guess a few options for this new game structure. As always, subscribe if you enjoyed the vid and leave down below any thoughts you have regarding this, as I'm super curious to find out what everyone thinks. I wanted to first talk about Zelda structure before Breath of the Wild, as I'm sure many of you had Breath of the Wild as your first Zelda game, and the open world structure is all you have known for Zelda. Before Breath of the Wild, Zelda games shared a few core factors, with dungeons being the massive part of the game. These dungeons contained so much character and were always super important, as they either locked away certain items or story progression behind them. I feel like this was one of the best part of these old games, as the atmosphere and puzzles in these dungeons were mostly always amazing and were often the best part of these games. To critique Breath of the Wild, even though it is an amazing game, the dungeons themselves often felt the most empty part of the game, as they all blend into one on style and their gimmicks all felt very restrictive. Aside from the four main divine beasts, the shrines acted as mini dungeons, being just a couple of puzzles at max, and some of these ideas would never get the chance to be fully fleshed out, unlike those in actual dungeons. I feel like the one change they could make in Tears of the Kingdom would be around these dungeons in some way, as they were the weakest part of Breath of the Wild in my opinion. Even if Tears of the Kingdom is still open world, I feel like they should at least give the new dungeons some cooler, more unique feelings to them, so it becomes distinct and memorable. Dungeons have always been a massive part of the Zelda series, so it'd be interesting to see how they are implemented in Tears of the Kingdom, and there may be a way to make them more linear by locking them behind certain vehicles or just some sort of craftable. For example, there could be a Sky Palace dungeon that is locked behind having to have this flying vehicle shown. Or if the game is going to continue being completely non-linear, I at least hope that we get plenty of dungeons to explore in whichever order takes our fancy. If you guys are enjoying the video so far, make sure you leave a like and subscribe, as there'll be much more content coming throughout the year, especially with the new Zelda game coming out. Moving on from dungeons, another aspect of the game's linearity is obviously the open world itself. Now, we do know that this game is set in the exact same Hyrule as Breath of the Wild, with a few distinct differences that we don't fully know how they occurred. It's most likely that since it's the same world, the game will at least have some sort of open world aspects where we can climb and travel wherever we want, just like in Breath of the Wild. Hopefully in Tears of the Kingdom we still get access to this open world, but unlike in Breath of the Wild, instead of being given the option to do the divine beasts and shrines in any order, we might get a set linear path to follow that would allow there to be a much stronger story, and as well will allow for the puzzles and challenges to ramp up in much more unique ways compared to Breath of the Wild's methods. These methods being the same enemies just getting stronger with more health rather than differing enemy types, and the puzzles in the dungeons and shrines having to stay relatively the same difficulty across the game, with the harder puzzles just leading extra items. These methods had to be in place for how Breath of the Wild was structured, but with the sequel they've had so much extra time to plan out much more robust systems or be able to somewhat set up structure into the game. To give an actual example of what sort of structure I think would work well with this new game, would be somewhat similar to Elden Ring's structure, which is an open world game just like Breath of the Wild, but instead of the world around you leveling up with you, there is somewhat of a path to follow towards your goal. This is done mainly through enemies, but can also be done through certain key items, which if Zelda was to do something like this, could include dungeons and puzzles with this structure. I feel like if Tears of the Kingdom was structured similar to that, both people preferring open world games and those that prefer more linear Zelda games would both be happy with the outcome. Now, with the background stuff out the way, I wanted to talk about some of my theories I have for Tears of the Kingdom story structure, and just the overall way this world would work together. Keep in mind, I might also be a little biased towards some more linear elements reminiscent of past Zelda games, just based on the games I have played. There are a couple of ideas that I think would be plausible, so let's start off with number 1. This is that the game shares an almost identical structure to Breath of the Wild, where there will be a bunch of dungeons, my guess is 7 with a tier at each end, and scattered around the entire map with a marker on it, and we're just given the choice in which order we want to complete them. This is very similar to the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild, as you could do these in any order you want. If you were able to do these in any order, the puzzles would all have to be based around abilities you would have at pretty much all times, similar to the runes of the Sheikah Slate, but now it will be on Link's power arm thing. Aside from these main dungeons, there will also be shrine-like challenges around the place, which could be these swirl-like things around the map or underground caverns, or even the sky islands. These would be how you gain stamina and hearts, or even other power-ups they might add in. Once the 7 main dungeons are complete, there will be a central location where the big baddie of the game will be fought, most likely in a really cool sky battle or something along those lines. This sort of structure is pretty much exactly the same as Breath of the Wild's, and I don't think they will keep it this close in structure, and honestly I hope they don't and do something a bit more unique. I also think that this game will have a really fast speedrun, as most of the game could be skipped very similar to Breath of the Wild speedrun. Theory number 2 would be my preferred structure for this game, that would combine a mixture of both linear and open world aspects. As for a purely linear game, I just don't feel like there will be a possibility of that, seeing the fact that it's set in the same world as Breath of the Wild's, and we have been shown many things such as climbing and enemy camps, which would be very out of place in a linear game. What I'm hoping for is that rather than the previous theory of structure being almost exactly the same as Breath of the Wild, I think that Tears of the Kingdom will take aspects of Breath of the Wild, but also give us a bunch of new exciting features such as the previously mentioned dungeons or other unrevealed, more linear story progression items and abilities. Now when I say I think it will be a mix, I mean much closer to an open world game, just with some more linear aspects or features with story or progression. Past 3D Zelda games such as Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time still had large worlds to explore, but certain things would be locked behind specific items or events. I feel like in Tears of the Kingdom we will both have tools to explore the world, but as well we can get upgraded tools or brand new items to explore unreachable areas. Seeing how with the Sky Islands and maybe even cave systems, these would be quite easy to lock behind certain items or story events, while also allowing most of the map to be explorable at any time. Again, mentioning Elden Ring, having certain areas be locked behind either hard bosses or special items would allow the game to feel as if the puzzles and enemies are getting harder naturally, while also still not losing that open world feel. This would also make speedrunning a bit more interesting, as it would allow for much more inventive routes to get discovered around certain triggers, as well as letting the main any percent of the speedrun involve more of the actual game. Overall, what I would like from this game is a mixture of Breath of the Wild's original open world, as well as aspects of a linear story that doesn't feel restrictive, but also much more coherent compared to Breath of the Wild's. So, what do you guys think about these theories? Do you think we will get an open world or a more classic linear Zelda game? I'd love to hear it down below, and if you've made it this far into the video, I would love it if you would subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.